Imagine spending decades sacrificing your own dreams to build a beautiful, stable life for your children, only to have them secretly plot to steal your home by convincing the world you are losing your mind. This is the chilling true story of a devoted mother who realized her own flesh and blood were treating her like a burden to be managed and an estate to be plundered. But what her greedy children didn't realize was that the woman they tried to silence was a master archivist with a flawless memory, and she was about to turn their cruel gaslighting into a master class of absolute justice. Let me introduce you to Eleanor. She is a 71-year-old widow and a mother of two who spent her entire life putting her family first. For decades, she worked diligently at the local library, carefully saving her money and cutting corners to provide for her family without a single complaint. She and her late husband, Raymond, laid every single brick of their beautiful home with their own hard-earned money, building a life completely free of mortgages and cosigners. Eleanor was the kind of mother who skipped personal vacations for 20 years so her children could have summer camps and braces. She even sold her own mother's precious wedding ring just to help her son, Jake, afford the down payment on his very first home. The quiet insidiousness of disrespect. Eleanor's nightmare didn't begin with a shouting match. It started with quiet, insidious whispers. Her children began calling her senile behind her back before a doctor had ever even diagnosed her with anything. The disrespect started subtly during a Sunday dinner when Eleanor accidentally fumbled and dropped a serving spoon on the floor. Instead of helping her, her son Jake leaned over and whispered to his wife, "See, it's starting." From that moment on, the emotional manipulation became a daily occurrence. Over the next few weeks, her home was filled with small, passive-aggressive comments and sideways glances. If she happened to repeat a story, her daughter Kelsey would offer a cold, condescending smile and snap, "You already told us that, Mom." They were deliberately planting seeds of doubt, trying to turn her into a ghost in her own life. A chilling discovery. Then came the moment Eleanor could no longer brush off as mere disrespect. While casually sorting through the mail on her porch swing, she opened a thick envelope from a local law firm. Inside, she found a legal document labeled Transfer of Durable Power of Attorney. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw that the terrifying form was already filled out with Jake's name. There had been absolutely no conversation and no warning, just an arrogant assumption that she was completely incapable of managing her own life. When Eleanor calmly confronted him that night about the legal forms, Jake looked her straight in the eye and patronizingly claimed it wasn't personal, stating they were just trying to protect her because she had been forgetful. The hallway revelation. But the true depth of their sickening greed was finally exposed one fateful afternoon. Eleanor had stepped back inside the house to grab her reading glasses, completely unnoticed by Jake and Kelsey, who thought she was still out in the backyard. Pausing quietly in the hallway, Eleanor overheard a conversation that shattered her heart. Kelsey coldly stated, "She can't even remember her own name. What if she signs something dangerous?" Instead of defending his mother, Jake simply laughed. He boldly replied, "She'll sign whatever we put in front of her soon, just a matter of time. Then the house is ours." Eleanor didn't move a muscle, and she didn't shed a single tear. She just stood there in the shadows, her hands trembling fiercely, not from the weakness of old age, but from pure, unadulterated fury. Her children honestly believed she couldn't remember her own name, but the truth was, she remembered absolutely everything. She remembered every lonely night she sat through school plays by herself while her husband worked night shifts, and now, she remembered the exact sound of their betrayal. They thought they were dealing with a fragile old woman they could easily push aside, but they never bothered to ask about the 40 years she spent cataloging and documenting everything in the library's archives. Eleanor's memory wasn't broken, it was highly weaponized. She absolutely refused to be buried alive while she was still breathing, and she was about to make them deeply regret ever doubting the fierce woman who raised them. In the immediate, suffocating aftermath of that devastating revelation in the hallway, most people would have stormed straight into the living room, tears streaming down their faces, and confronted their children right then and there. It is the most natural human reaction to demand immediate answers when the very people you brought into this world casually discuss stealing your home and erasing your autonomy. But Eleanor did not confront Jake and Kelsey. She knew instinctively that reacting with pure, unbridled emotion was exactly what her treacherous children were banking on. They desperately wanted her to seem erratic, hysterical, and emotionally unstable, so they could easily point a finger to the outside world and say, "Look, her mind is going." Instead of giving them the satisfaction of a breakdown, Eleanor quietly retreated into the shadows of her own home and began to meticulously construct a defense that would completely destroy their greedy agenda. That very night, when the house was finally quiet and her toxic children had left the premises, Eleanor sat down at the old, familiar oak desk in her bedroom. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a fresh, leather-bound journal. She didn't use it to write down sad poetry or vent her despair. She used it to build an impenetrable fortress. She began writing down absolutely everything. She carefully documented every single suspicious change around the house, every passive-aggressive comment her children made, and every single time they deliberately moved an object only to falsely claim she had lost it. She officially labeled this journal the Book of Truth, because she knew exactly where this insidious situation was headed. She realized with absolute, heartbreaking clarity that her children weren't going to approach her with genuine love, understanding, or compassion. They were inevitably coming for her with complex legal papers, expensive lawyers, deeply fake concern, and very real, unadulterated greed. But what Jake and Kelsey completely failed to consider, and what they never even bothered to ask about, was the fact that their mother had spent 40 long years meticulously cataloging, cross-referencing, and documenting every single item that had ever passed through the local library's archives. Eleanor's memory was not broken in the slightest. It was practically weaponized, and she was preparing to make them severely regret doubting the very woman who raised them. As Eleanor began deeply investigating her own life, she realized the signs of their hostile takeover had been coming slowly, hidden in little, seemingly harmless shifts. It started innocently enough, like the time Jake offered to kindly help out with her bills, asking for full access to her online accounts just so he could supposedly keep things tidy for her. But when Eleanor scrutinized her bank statements with fresh eyes, she noticed her grocery account showed bizarre charges for items she had never actually bought. There were charges for expensive wine that she didn't even drink and clothing that she never wore. When she had innocently asked Jake about these financial discrepancies in the past, he had simply shrugged it off, casually claiming he probably just used the wrong card by mistake. He promised he would fix the error, but of course, he never did. Then, the strange mail started arriving, letters she had never seen before in her life, some of which were already opened, and others that were aggressively marked as past due. The final straw was when she discovered a random cable bill addressed to an unfamiliar apartment complex she had never even lived in. Hoping for some logical clarity, she had previously taken the bill to Kelsey, who just smiled her condescending smile and suggested Eleanor must have gotten confused and grabbed someone else's mail. But the chilling detail was that the bill clearly had Eleanor's name, her exact address, and her personal signature right on it. Driven by a growing sense of dread, Eleanor opened a hidden shoebox tucked under her bed where she safely kept old birthday cards and vital bank statements. She laid the documents out and started carefully comparing the signatures. That is when the horrifying reality hit her. The signatures were not the same. Someone in her own family was actively signing legal documents on her behalf. Her hands, the very same hands that once lovingly turned hundreds of pages every single week, suddenly felt as cold as stone. The theft of her identity was happening quietly and deliberately. Her own children were systematically trying to turn her into a ghost in her very own life. Knowing she needed irrefutable, scientific proof to counter their gaslighting, Eleanor executed the next phase of her master plan. First, she immediately contacted Dr. Riley, her trusted general physician who had treated her for nearly 20 long years. When she arrived at his office, she didn't ask for a simple checkup. She specifically asked him to run every single memory test, cognitive exam, and detailed neurological scan that was medically available. The grueling, comprehensive appointment took nearly 3 hours to complete. When they finally finished the exhaustive testing, Dr. Riley sat down across from her and offered a gentle, reassuring smile. He looked her in the eye and confirmed the truth she already knew, stating, "Your memory is fine. Above average for your age, even, you're still sharp." But Eleanor knew kind words wouldn't hold up in a courtroom against greedy lawyers. She firmly asked her doctor for official documentation, not just a brief letter of recommendation, but a full, comprehensive medical report that was officially stamped, legally signed, and fully certified. Dr. Riley handed over the bulletproof documents without a single moment of hesitation, and Eleanor promptly made 6 exact copies of the life-saving paperwork. With her medical competency firmly established, Eleanor knew she needed to secure her financial and legal assets before her children could drain them entirely. She picked up the phone and called Elaine, her absolute oldest and most trusted friend. Eleanor and Elaine shared a bond that ran incredibly deep. They had originally met back in college, became dedicated mothers in the exact same year, and had tragically buried their respective husbands within just 2 years of each other. But in this specific crisis, Elaine was valuable for more than just her emotional support. Elaine was a formidable legal professional who had spent 25 highly successful years working as a paralegal for a prominent probate attorney. When Eleanor bravely confessed exactly what her children were secretly doing, Elaine didn't hesitate for a single second. Like a true guardian angel, Elaine showed up at Eleanor's front door the very next morning, armed with a heavy leather briefcase and greeting her old friend with a fierce, unwavering hug. Together, the two women rolled up their sleeves and meticulously went through absolutely everything, combing through years of bank statements, complex property records, and vital insurance policies. Combining Eleanor's archiving brilliance with Elaine's legal expertise, they carefully assembled a massive, undeniable binder of evidence that possessed the power to make any noisy courtroom go dead silent. They proudly labeled this impenetrable file preemptive defense. To lock everything down completely, they formally filed a protective affidavit with the local county clerk. This brilliant legal document explicitly stated that Eleanor had absolutely no intent whatsoever to transfer the ownership of her hard-earned assets, that she displayed absolutely no signs of cognitive impairment, and that she had definitively not authorized any power of attorney to anyone in her family. It acted as an invisible, impenetrable legal firewall around her entire life's work. Perhaps the most incredible part of Eleanor's brilliant defense strategy was her ironclad restraint. After building a legal fortress that could withstand a hurricane, she didn't tell Jake or Kelsey a single, solitary word about what she had done. Instead, she chose to masterfully play along with their cruel game. When Jake and Kelsey inevitably brought over their slick, fast-talking lawyer, a man who smiled far too much and patronizingly called Eleanor "sweetheart" in a sickening way that tasted like dust, she didn't throw him out of the house. She sat quietly as the lawyer tried to manipulate her, falsely claiming, "This is just a standard form, and we just want to keep your interests protected." Eleanor simply smiled sweetly, nodded her head agreeably, politely offered the manipulative man a cup of hot tea, and absolutely refused to sign a single thing they put in front of her. Every time they left, she immediately went back to her book of truth, diligently writing down every single detail of the visit, every manipulative word spoken, and every cruel eye roll from Kelsey whenever Eleanor pretended to need clarification on the legal jargon. She documented every infuriating instance where Jake smugly patted her hand and said, "Don't worry, Mom, just trust me." Eleanor even began taking the extraordinary step of recording certain conversations quietly and legally, capturing just enough undeniable audio evidence to remind herself that she wasn't just imagining this terrifying madness. She was letting her children dig their own graves, entirely unaware that the confused mother they were trying to scam was holding the ultimate shovel. One Thursday morning, the ultimate legal strike arrived in the form of a thick envelope delivered by a courier. It wasn't a standard piece of mail. Inside was a formal petition for guardianship that had been filed directly by her son, Jake, and fully supported by her daughter, Kelsey. The documents aggressively claimed that she was mentally unfit to care for herself, stating on the official record that she was suffering from early dementia and had become combative, forgetful, and confused. They used those exact words to paint a completely fabricated picture of the very woman who raised them. Jake even formally listed her own beautifully maintained house as an unsecured residence unfit for elder care. Adding to the falsehoods, Kelsey claimed in the documents that her mother had once forgotten her name during a phone call. When Eleanor read that specific part, she laughed out loud. It wasn't because the situation was funny, but because the claim was so maliciously rehearsed. They had clearly been planting these lies for months to build their fraudulent case. But what her greedy children hadn't counted on was that the woman they were actively trying to erase was the one person who had built her life on remembering the absolute truth. The hardest part of this nightmare wasn't the initial betrayal, nor was it the fabricated lies written in ink and passed through legal channels as if they were facts. It was the slow, deliberate, and deeply cruel isolation that followed. The very day after she received the petition, Jake showed up at her house completely unannounced. Acting as if he were offering peace, he held out his hand and jingled a set of car keys. He casually told his mother he was taking them just until the hearing, stripping away her mobility in an instant. Eleanor didn't argue, and she didn't scream. She just stood quietly and watched him drive off in her car, knowing full well her name was still on the title. She never saw that car again. The next week, the financial suffocation began when her credit card stopped working at the local pharmacy. When Eleanor called the bank for an explanation, they stated the card had been frozen due to inactivity. But Eleanor knew the real truth. Jake had added online alerts to her account months ago. He had used the passwords he'd previously offered to help keep track of her finances to lock her out of her own money. Just like that, one vital piece of independence after another was systematically taken from her. She realized this is exactly how elder exploitation works, not with chains and shouting, but with gentle, patronizing smiles and slowly disappearing options. Desperate for genuine connection, she tried calling Kelsey, but there was no answer. Next, she called her teenage granddaughter, Emily. Emily picked up on the first ring, but instead of her usual cheerful greeting, she whispered "Grandma" into the receiver as if she wasn't supposed to be talking to her. Eleanor forced cheer into her voice and asked about school, but there was a heavy pause on the line. Then, the young girl said something that cracked Eleanor's heart in two. "Mom says you don't even know who I am anymore." Eleanor couldn't speak for a second as the agonizing silence between them grew heavy. Emily quickly continued, assuring her grandmother that she didn't believe her mother's lies. Emily stated she thought her parents were being mean, pointing out that Eleanor remembered her birthday last month and even sent a specific book she wanted. Emily astutely noted that people who forget things don't remember special stuff like that. Swallowing a painful lump in her throat, Eleanor thanked her granddaughter and promised, "I remember everything that matters." After they hung up, Eleanor sat in the quiet of her home, her hands trembling, not from age, but from absolute fury. Her own children had looked their children in the eyes and told them she was losing her mind. Her grandchildren were being taught that their grandmother was a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be loved. Eleanor knew what gaslighting looked like from reading memoirs and hearing stories from women at church, but knowing it in theory was vastly different from living it. Suddenly, every word she spoke and every natural pause in conversation felt like a test where she was being judged for mental decay. The psychological warfare peaked one afternoon when Kelsey stopped by the house unexpectedly. She confidently marched into the kitchen, aggressively opened Eleanor's fridge, and sighed loudly. Kelsey pulled out a container and said, "There's expired yogurt in here, Mom." This is what I mean when I say we're worried. Eleanor quietly defended herself, stating it had only expired yesterday and she simply hadn't taken the trash out yet. Kelsey dismissively clucked her tongue and claimed Eleanor had left the stove on the previous month. Eleanor remembered the incident perfectly. She had turned it off 2 minutes later because she was boiling tea water. Kelsey ignored the sane explanation and began scanning the kitchen with cold calculation, acting like an appraiser sizing up a distressed property. The true motive for the visit was revealed as Kelsey pulled out a thick manila folder. She announced that these were the arrangements she and Jake had worked out. She pitched it as a nice assisted living center where Eleanor would have a bathroom and a small garden. Eleanor calmly took the folder and slid it into a drawer, politely saying, "Thank you, I'll look over it." Kelsey looked genuinely surprised and disappointed that she didn't elicit a breakdown. But what her manipulative daughter didn't know was that the drawer had a tiny, voice-activated audio recorder hidden inside. Eleanor was collecting hard evidence, knowing that if they tried to put her away, they would have to do it with her wide awake and with a trail behind them. That night, Eleanor opened her book of truth and wrote every detail down. She documented the visit, the yogurt argument, the assisted living pamphlet, and the promised garden. Then, she opened her laptop and began uploading scanned copies of every journal entry, secret recording, and legal document directly into a secure cloud drive. To ensure her safety, she sent access to her paralegal friend Elaine and her physician, Dr. Riley. If her children were going to try to bury her alive with lies, Eleanor was going to shine a spotlight on every truth they hoped she wouldn't remember. The greatest irony was that they counted on her remaining silent. Eleanor had spent her life as the background of their story, the woman who cooked, cleaned, supported, sacrificed, bent, and yielded. But now, she was the one writing the story, and her voice was finally going to be heard. Courtrooms are significantly colder than they look in the movies, not just in their physical temperature, but in their absolute spirit. There is something deeply unsettling about the polished wooden benches, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, and the low murmur of paperwork being shuffled that makes you feel like you are already on trial the second you walk through the doors. Eleanor had not stepped foot inside a courthouse in over 30 years, not since she and her late husband Raymond had proudly finalized the deed to their land. But on that fateful morning, she walked in wearing her husband's old watch and the blue wool coat she saved strictly for special occasions. She stood tall, her spine straight, and every gray strand of her hair pinned back like armor. Her loyal friend Elaine walked right beside her, carrying a thick black binder of evidence and wearing a fierce look that could turn cement to dust. Jake and Kelsey were already seated at the front of the room. Jake wore an urine charcoal suit, while Kelsey wore a look of fake pity that hung in the air like cloying perfume. They cowardly refused to make eye contact with their mother. Their slick lawyer, Mr. Granger, nodded as Eleanor passed and offered a polite good morning, to which she simply smiled and replied, "We'll see." The judge, a sharp-eyed, middle-aged woman whose wedding band gleamed under the harsh lights, entered the room and took her seat to begin the proceedings. Jake stood up first, speaking in a highly rehearsed, sickly sweet tone that Eleanor had never heard him use before. He began by falsely claiming to the judge that the situation wasn't easy for them and that they truly loved their mother. However, he aggressively lied, stating that over the past year, Eleanor had been forgetting basic things like names, dates, and even how to get to the store. He pointed out that they had found expired food and missed bills, claiming she was stubbornly refusing their help. Kelsey then dabbed a completely dry eye with a tissue and offered an outright, polished lie, stating that Eleanor had recently failed to recognize her own granddaughter Emily's face. Adding to the circus of deception, Mr. Granger submitted a folder of fabricated evidence to the court, showing erratic banking statements that did not even match Eleanor's personal handwriting. When the judge finally turned and informed Eleanor that she had the right to speak, the brave mother stood up slowly, not because she was frail, but because she wanted her betrayers to feel the agonizing weight of every single step she took. Elaine placed the massive binder on the table, and Eleanor opened it. She calmly explained that she had spent the past 6 months keeping a daily journal documenting her routines and the strange occurrences in her home. Flipping through the pages, She read an entry from April 14th noting that Kelsey had deliberately unscrewed the fridge light bulb to simulate neglect, and another from April 27th proving that Jake had secretly set himself up as a secondary user with online access to her bank account. Jake's face immediately paled, and Kelsey's lips pressed tightly together. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She flipped to May 12th, pulled a small audio recorder from her hand, and pressed play. Jake's crystal-clear voice echoed throughout the entire courtroom without any distortion. The recording captured him callously stating, "She's too out of it to know what's hers anymore. Just give it a few months. Then we can sell the place and split it." The courtroom fell dead silent. Even the confident Mr. Granger leaned back slightly in his chair in utter defeat. Eleanor looked directly at the judge and delivered the ultimate blow. "I may be old. I may forget where I left my keys or whether I fed the cat, but I haven't forgotten who I am. I haven't forgotten what's mine, and I certainly haven't forgotten what betrayal sounds like." Elaine then handed over the certified doctor's report from Dr. Riley, signed and dated just 2 weeks prior, proving Eleanor's immaculate cognitive health. The judge sharply asked Jake if he had obtained the power of attorney with his mother's actual consent, forcing him to stammer out a pathetic no. Without hesitation, the judge officially denied the petition for guardianship and explicitly informed Eleanor she retained all rights to her estate, her assets, and her independence. The judge also added that Eleanor had the right to file claims for elder abuse and financial manipulation. Jake lowered his head, and Kelsey turned her face away in shame. Eleanor walked out of the courtroom far stronger than she had walked in, having permanently reminded her greedy children that this old woman still had a voice that they would never drown out again. The silence after the hearing was louder than the gavel. The court had denied their petition, yes, but the damage had been done, not just to Eleanor's name, but to her soul. Her children, the very ones she held when they were helpless, had sat in front of a judge and painted her as a confused old woman who could barely function. But Eleanor wasn't interested in merely surviving the ambush. She wanted closure and absolute justice. Back home, she opened a folder she and Elaine had labeled Phase 2. Inside was a copy of the emergency revocation notice she had quietly filed with the county registrar months ago, which removed any old medical proxies and froze any pending property transactions tied to her name. She even had proof of a rejected DMV application in Jake's handwriting from when he had tried to transfer the title of her car to himself. They submitted it all to the same judge and filed a formal complaint with Adult Protective Services because the law needed to know this wasn't an issue of forgetfulness. It was fraud. When the investigator came 2 weeks later, Eleanor calmly answered questions and played a new, highly incriminating audio recording. This recording captured Jake plotting with Kelsey, stating, "Once we get her in the care home, we'll clean out the attic and list the property." The very next day, Jake and Kelsey received certified letters notifying them of a pending inquiry into elder exploitation, and copies were discreetly sent to their employers, too. It was only then that her children suddenly scrambled, sending desperate text messages claiming they were still family. But Eleanor refused to respond to people who used the concept of blood as a hall pass for profound cruelty. To ensure the truth could never be buried, she met with a local journalist who specialized in elder law abuse, providing everything on the record. A month later, the explosive article went live under the title, "She Remembered Everything: A Mother's Fight Against Her Own Children's Greed." The indisputable truth crashed through their lives. Jake lost his job after his employer read the article, and Kelsey's marriage didn't survive the shame before she moved out of state entirely. The two siblings never spoke to each other again, their illusion of unity completely fractured by what they did and what they lost. Meanwhile, Eleanor finally found profound, healing peace in her home. She started planting again, just some basil and marigolds, and realized that her terrifying experience was not rare, but just quiet. Determined to make noise, she bravely started a weekly podcast called The Mind is Still Mine with the help of Elaine and her granddaughter, Emily. Armed with just her voice, some tea, and a microphone, She shared crucial tips on spotting red flags and reminded her growing audience that aging is never a valid consent for disrespect. She helped countless others find their power, including a woman in Indiana who almost signed over her property until she heard Eleanor's story. The ultimate validation of her legacy arrived one afternoon during a small fundraiser for senior outreach programs. Jake's ex-wife, Tasha, nervously approached Eleanor, offering a sincere apology for knowing something wasn't right but staying out of it. Tasha then handed her a small envelope from Emily. Inside was a printed copy of Emily's college admissions essay, beautifully titled, "The Woman Who Remembered Everything." In it, the young girl wrote about how her grandmother taught her to tell the truth even when it hurts, and how she turned a courtroom into a battleground to walk out a survivor. Eleanor cried, not from sadness, but because she finally saw exactly what she had kept: a legacy that moves forward, teaches, and protects. They had told the world she couldn't remember her own name, but what they had actually given her was an unbreakable voice that she would never let be taken away. The valuable lesson for the listener. Eleanor's journey is a chilling but profoundly inspiring reminder of how insidious elder exploitation can be. As her story demonstrates, this kind of abuse doesn't always start with heavy chains and loud shouting, but rather with gentle, patronizing smiles and a series of slowly disappearing options. Key takeaways to remember. Document the truth. When someone tries to manipulate your reality or gaslight you into believing you are losing your mind, meticulous documentation and collecting hard evidence becomes your absolute best defense. Refuse to be erased. Manipulators often rely on their victims remaining silent and staying conveniently in the background. Eleanor proved to the world that aging is never a valid consent for disrespect. Reclaim your voice. Even when people attempt to strip away your independence and falsely claim you cannot remember your own name, you have the power to fight back with the undeniable truth. The ultimate lesson is that you do not have to be a silent victim in a narrative written by greedy individuals. You can actively write your own story and build a resilient legacy that teaches and protects others. No matter your age, your voice is yours, and you should never let it be taken away.